Welcome, everyone, to the ESG Decoded podcast. I'm your host today, Amanda Shea, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Shireen Muhiudeen, an experienced emerging markets fund manager and public board director with extensive experience serving on investment, nomination and governance, compensation, risk, and ESG committees within banking, port, plantation, property, and media companies. Shireen was the first female chair of the Malaysian Stock Exchange and the former CEO of AIG Investment Corporation Malaysia. She is also the author of the best-selling book, We Are All Stakeholders, Culture, Politics, and Radical Accountability in the Boardroom. I'm excited to be speaking to Shireen today to learn her perspectives on ESG and stakeholder capitalism and diving into what she talks about a lot in her book, Radical Accountability in the Boardroom. Shireen, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Morning. Thank you, Amanda, for having me. I do hope that the listeners today are going to enjoy what we're going to be discussing about how important it is for everyone to be a stakeholder in this whole ESG sustainability issue.
I think that's, in the end, what it's all about is realizing that expanding our view of who is a stakeholder to our organization or to our business than perhaps we may have thought about a few decades ago or even a few years ago. But as we, I think, understand more of our impacts around the world, we're also expanding that understanding of our stakeholders. But let's get kind of back up a little bit. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about why you think ESG sustainability is so important at this time.
Well, if you don't mind, I just want to take you back into when I first started as a fund manager. This was going back into the 90s. I started in the 80s, and then by the 90s, we had the Asian financial crisis. And you know that whenever you have a financial crisis, companies, whatever's going wrong is going to be increased, escalated, made look worse. So in the 90s, we suddenly saw where companies were breaking apart. There was one particular company that was building a dam. And it was a massive dam that was going to be 3 times the size of Singapore. And all the people there, the villagers, the Penans, the wildlife, all of them were supposed to be relocated. So I had gone into a company visit, typical of what most fund managers do. They go and visit the companies before they invest. And I asked the CFO, who was there at the time, who happened to be my ex-colleague from the 80s, and I said, what's going to happen to the wildlife and what's going to happen to the villagers? And he turned around to me and he said, Shireen, why do you care? And, making money for people as a fund manager, making rich people rich is not that difficult. But when you start to look how you make the money, that's when it started to really hit my conscience. I'm also a scuba diver, and watching what the environment was doing to the corals really made me start to think, money has power. And if the fund managers could get together and we could stop some of these practices and start getting people to think a little bit longer term, start thinking about how we could do things better so that we actually last, your businesses last, and everything around you lasts. So this was the beginning point for me, that I started to think that I needed to do something. It wasn't enough for me just to stay put managing money, managing different mandates around the region. So in the early 2000s, I left AIG and I set up a firm just to do responsible investing. Now, in the beginning, when we look at the main building block of ESG, it's G. Because governance, if you have no governance, everything else doesn't matter. And my firm belief, governance is transparency in processes. So as long as you can explain your process and you're transparent, you are actually achieving governance. And when you have governance, you can then look at the environment and you look at social issues. And that combined becomes your sustainability. So it's all tied in. And I think that for your listeners, I want them to know that I'm very pro-business. It's not as if I don't think that business, stop doing this, stop doing that. I don't think so. But I do think that it's a way of managing your business so that you don't hurt the future so badly. so that you don't destroy the future for others. This is something where, you talk about sustainability, you talk about looking to ensure that, how you operate, where you operate, when you operate, all these types of things suddenly will come to, the discussion table later on in life, or, in the organization, to make sure that you understand that you can't just keep on exploiting at all costs. And I know business is about exploitation. I'm not kidding anybody. It is about exploitation. It's about first mover advantage, but you can do it the right way. So that is basically how this all started, Amanda.
Thank you for sharing that. It's always interesting to me to talk to different people on the podcast and hear, what spurred them, what was that moment where they realized they needed to do something different, and especially when they had the power to do something different. So thank you for sharing that very real story about when it but also I agree with you that governance underpins all of this, and without good governance, it's just a lot of nice talk in the end around what we're doing for the people or for planet. Something that you write about in your book is really the importance of effective boards. And I think that connects to having strong governance, especially in this period where we are trying to transition to a low carbon economy. We're trying to achieve Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals. I would love to hear more from you about that and hear more about kind of your thoughts about that.
So if I can just, again, go back into history, what I saw. So as a regional fund manager, you go around the region visiting companies. If you have to ride a motorbike, you ride a motorbike, to see whether it works. So what I noticed is that as I was going around the region, and this goes back into maybe 2007, 2008, there were hardly any women. So this was my, and every time I went to visit companies and we were talking about their boards, I would say, who's on your board? And perhaps only Philippines had a few more women than the other countries. Generally, it was very, very low. And the response was, whenever I asked, come you don't have any women representation? Oh, nobody's qualified. That was the common statement. So I then did a research project that spanned from 1997 to 2010 on 3,000 companies in the region, looking to see whether companies that have women on boards perform better. And the evidence was clear that you could see that having diversity, different people, helped boards. Now, I don't know if the companies that had those women were actually progressive to have women in the first place. I don't know that. I can't justify that. But one thing I could see is that when you had 3 or more women, the companies did better. And this was over 6 different fundamental variables. So once I could see how important the boards were in terms of diversity, I started looking at how boards operate. And then through my own experience, the key word that comes up over and over again is culture. And culture is something I think people don't really take into account. So for example, when you talk about, if you're an unlisted company, private company, and you want to have an investor, the money that is invested in you comes with culture attached. So for example, if your company does not have strong ethos, does not have strong convictions of what you want to be as a company, and you have various people who come in with money, their culture attached to that money is going to impact you as a company. And I've seen it over and over again. And the more power, or the larger the stake of that money that comes in, the more power and the more dominating or domineering that person will be in your company. And where does that happen? That happens in the board, because the board is the highest level of decision making. So if you have culture, which is leadership in another word, and you have the highest decision of making at the board level, it is really leadership at the highest the highest level of decision making. So this is why the boards become so important. I don't think people realize the importance of it. And then when you look at who's in the board, which is what I spend a lot of time doing, companies that fail, just take a case in point, recently in Silicon Valley Bank, the analysis of the board members would be critical to know why that board failed. I'm not sure if anybody in the United States is looking at that, discussing it, but if I was in the US and I was looking at what happened, that would be the first place I go to. Why did it fail? Who were the board members? What were their skill sets? What were their policies to ensure that, you know, there was safe credit lending or controlled credit lending? Most banks around the world is because of a run. And that's what happened. And you wonder, is it because they didn't have confidence in the leadership? Did they not have confidence in the board? So this is how my interest in boards started. It was really from the diversity project that I did. And then when you go into looking at boards, I think that you will only understand it once you're in it. And I've had quite a few experiences of being in boards, being as an alternate to a board member. I've been on committees, and you see all sorts. And could I confidently say that everybody on the board that I have met is there for the best interest of the company? I can say no, quite easily. And that is the failing. I feel that if you had, or if we had globally a little bit more stringent measures, how people become board members, I think we would have better run companies. And then you look at this whole movement of diversity. And what I find quite ludicrous is that women generally around the world are required to go for board training. But it's not the same for the other side. You know, I just don't understand it. Why is it that women need to go for board training, but other board members don't? And just because you're trained, it doesn't mean that you're going to become a good board member. So, you know, there are many, many questions about the board. And of course, there are lots of organizations that claim that they can train you and place you. And many corporate women that I've met, be it in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, they all want to get on boards. They all want to contribute. You know, many of them, you know, their family life has changed. They've got time on their hands. They've got specific skill. But goodness, it is so tough for them. So tough. It is quite sad when I speak to and meet these wonderfully skilled women, and yet they can't get a place at the board. They can't contribute. So this is just my backdrop of how I became so interested in boards and roles of board members, types of board members. I'm fascinated by personalities on the board. And in the book, you know, I talk about people throwing chairs. It's true. These are not make-up stories. And you have people who come into the board who are, you know, abusive, shouting, and then when we have a break or something, they're just laughing and jovial as if, oh yeah, nothing's happened, haha. It's almost like you're dealing with mad people. So you have all types on boards, some highly skilled, some not so skilled. So
I think, as you said, for people who have not been in that boardroom, I think we assume that board members have the qualifications, have the leadership skills, have the best interest of the company at heart. And for me, it was, when I was reading your book, it was very enlightening to say that's not necessarily the case, as you mentioned, in many cases, but maybe not all. And I think your research is so interesting because I've seen similar research in other parts of the world where we see that on various business metrics, KPIs, performance, where when the board is diverse, there is better business performance. And so I'm happy to hear that your research showed the same thing in the Asia Pacific region. You mentioned, what do you think we need to do, or what do you think needs to change to continue to this movement towards diversifying boards, getting more women on boards, more diversity of thought on boards? What do you think needs to happen? What would you like to see happen?
I think that, and this is what I try even wherever I am, is that to have, most companies have subsidiaries. At least if we're talking about a public listed company, they'll have some of their other holding companies that are not listed, is to allow the women in the organization, whether they are, we call them Exco -1, -2, so management level -1, -2, get those -2, -1 to be on a subsidiary board first. They can even be an alternate board member as a starting point. I was an alternate board member in my early days. I must have been in my 20s. And it gave me guidance of how a board operates, even the whole activity of, what's in a board, who are the committee members, what are the meetings expected, how are board discussions recorded. All these types of things I learned at a very early stage. So I could see then when I went into other boards where the weaknesses were. And if we could get more young, and not even just young, more women who are in C-2 as alternates within the group, I do think that this will give them, it's much more than training, because you're having real life experiences. And one thing I find with training is that sometimes training organizations don't understand the culture of the country. So you can't just pick up in one country and go to another country and think that it's all the same. It's not. It's very different. And what and how you perform in or as a board member in one country doesn't necessarily mean it's acceptable in another country. And if you, and many companies now are global, they have offices all around the world, knowing how to behave is very important. Some of the big O&G, oil and gas companies in this part of the world, they actually have briefings for people who arrive in what you can and can't do. And I think that those, what you can and can't do are very, very important. And it's all about culture. And understanding culture takes you a long way in business. I really think that is something that is overlooked, because I firmly believe, culture, leadership is how we can get the companies to survive. And if you have leadership and culture in the boardroom where people are aware of the community, they go into a country, they go into an environment, they go into an area, and they appreciate those people there. They don't just come in and think, right, how can I exploit this? And I think businesses are becoming more aware, basically because of the phone, because of what the internet can do. In the old days, people would try and whistleblow maybe with a photograph of a document that they have to try and photocopy secretly at the Xerox machine. Now, with the phone, it's very dangerous. Even in general meetings, they film. Even in areas where, on a company visit, you're not supposed to do something, they film. Migrant labor being abused, they film, they upload, the company is shamed. So companies now are very aware of stakeholders. They're very aware to make sure that they don't do something completely stupid because it's going to be known within seconds around the world. And I think this is positive. I mean, of course, sometimes people are just becoming, awful and they just want to destroy a company. I don't believe in that. But I do believe it keeps people on the toes. So now, even when you go into a restaurant, if somebody gets served, like a cockroach in their food, before nobody would believe you. But now, quickly the phone comes out, zapped, and it's around the world.
And I think also on the other side of that phone, right, I think stakeholders have become more aware, more educated, and I feel like especially with the younger generation, they're just more their level of knowledge is higher than when I was at their age around these environmental and social issues. And I think part of
Yes.
this, this immediate access to information is all driving that.
No, agreed. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, even for example, when we look at the issues of migrant labor, which are very dear to my heart, because I get it, companies want to do well. I get it that they want to make money, but I don't think that you should abuse, especially foreign laborers, because they can't go home. And during the COVID, it was very clear to me, there were lots of exposés done by many media groups around the world, and it was just shameful. And now when you look at the Ukraine crisis and you look at human trafficking coming out of that, it's just so awful. And I think that having the media the way it is, safeguards many people. There are places which will tell you exactly what you do when you arrive in a country. Look at make sure that your telephone is registered. Make sure you scan this link so people can follow you. Human trafficking or labor abuse now in factories, not so easy because of the phone. They show how they're living their living conditions, 6 people to the bed, can't roll over, their hours, they're actually monitored, how many hours they are working. Things like that now are being exposed. And I think that all these fat profits need to be rethought. I mean, these type of issues, I feel, is just not acceptable. And companies can take a 10% cut or whatever it is, and just have your workers looked after a little bit more. I think perhaps in the United States, this is not really such a problem, but in the rest of the world, and some of these companies are linked to global companies. It's not as if they're not. Human rights in terms of human trafficking is something that has really escalated, especially during COVID. And now many workers don't want to come back. So all these, economies that were growing rapidly, they had foreign labor. Now the foreign labor doesn't want to come back because they know exactly what's going to happen. And when their friends, upload what's happening to them wherever they are, they say, right, I'm not going. I'd rather go somewhere else where I'm a little bit safeguarded. So definitely there have been changes, and I've seen it through my time from the late 80s to where we are today, how the whole narrative on responsible investing, ESG, sustainability has evolved, and it will continue to evolve. Right now we talk about net zero. I think that, as we go forward, people will start paying more attention to plastic pollution, which is just shocking in our part of the world. Safeguarding the waters, safeguarding the oceans, the forests. I think that they will start coming out with actual details of what you need to do to safeguard. Right now, we're just talking about degree of temperature and greenhouse gas emissions, calculating scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But I do think that this will move, and it needs to keep moving. We need to keep focusing on how can we be better people. And yes, do business by all means, but we need to care a little. I think that's very apparent to me now.
I, I think I go back to what she said in the beginning. It's not only making money, but it's how we make our money and
Yes.
taking care, right, of our stakeholders. And I I do believe human rights are an issue here, even in the United States. We see child labor on the rise for many years, and it's very, very concerning
Oh,
to see that happening here, where for many, many years it was on the decrease, and we thought we were basically about to stamp it out, and we're seeing quite the opposite. So I think, and there's obviously other social issues here too, but I think, like you mentioned, understanding the impacts on the environment and also on your people and your stakeholders, whether they're employees, your customers, your communities, and being responsible in the end and making money in a way that your customer will want to spend their money with you, right? Or your investors will want to
yes.
invest in you. That yeah, in this age of kind of radical transparency, we have to be mindful of all this. We can't ignore it any longer.
No, we can't. I mean, I think the companies who think that they're able to get away with this, those days are over. And right now there's a big push for board members to learn a little bit more about some of these issues. Some boards are completely not going to change, refuse to change. Some boards just want to, or companies, they just want to change optically, make sure that their annual, their sustainability reports look the right way, but they're not actually doing the right thing. Some companies are actually doing things. They really are trying. My concern is that, many of these organizations go to, either their own audit firms or consultants. And then the whole issue comes into the board of cost. And that's what makes me really cross. This shouldn't be only, you shouldn't be looking at this to, you can only achieve it if you spend loads of money on a consultant. I really believe that any capable CFO should look to hire somebody within the group to become their chief sustainability officer. They can, groom them. It's not very difficult. It's quite clear what needs to happen. There's lots of information. And just do things with small steps. Every little bit that we do will help. And I think that that's far more important than producing these glossy reports about sustainability and, we planted 25 trees. These are issues that I just feel like it's such common sense. It's not that difficult. It's almost like when you look at some of the issues of bribery. Previously, in the old days, you were allowed to bribe. It wasn't considered bad. When companies went abroad, they would bribe because that was the way they said, it was the culture of doing business there. Now you're not allowed to. It's frowned upon. You might face a deferred prosecution agreement, huge fines. You need to be ready for this. So if you can address bribes as something that's not right, you can do the same thing for the environment and social issues. And once you start seeing heavy fines for environmental issue breaches, heavy fines for not compliant once they have these enforceable standards. See, right now we don't have enforceable standards on environmental issues and social issues. I mean, there are laws within the governments. There are laws within the countries. However, it takes a long time for proof. It takes, and you have lobbyists. So it's a lot more complicated to get fined. But if you had these issues of environment and human trafficking or social within, for example, the Companies Act rules, listing rules for public listed companies, or even in constitutions, all these things, if they are immediately enforceable, companies will buck up. The minute you say you're going to be fined and you directors are going to be fined, everybody will sit up. When you have something as a wish list, a code, oh, it would be nice to have, everybody is not so bothered. They'll just say, okay, we'll wait. So, for example, in the old days, when you looked at some of the accounting standards, they were a lot more broader. Now they get more and more narrowed. They get more and more prescriptive. Companies pay attention because they don't want to be fined. So every time the auditors come in, we're like, oh no, annual audit, here we go. Or worst case, you have an internal audit. There's a problem. There's a direct inquiry. All these things suddenly will make people sit up because it's enforceable. So this is where it will get to. ISSB is coming out with some of the rules. It will be enforceable under the accounting rules. I think that once that starts to happen, my guess it will be by 25. Some say it'll be 24, but I should think that, things are not always so easy to implement, and especially when it comes to accounting rules, because you've got GAAP in the United States, you've got IFRS in the rest of the world. So, the local version of the IFRS. So these type of things will take a while to come through. But once they come through, it's just going to start to go more and more. And probably they will start looking at traceability of your product is going to be a big thing. So people are going to ask. The United States now, of course, wants to know where is your product manufactured. They need to know. So traceability of your supply chain is probably going to end up in an annual report. And there's going to be detail of it as well as potential fines for any breaches. So this is where, again, the internet, the eye in the sky, all these things have changed the way business is done.
I think that's an area that we're seeing a lot of focus on too, is supply chain. I think I want to say maybe a few years ago, the investor is probably the loudest stakeholder in the room. And now we're seeing this push towards customers pushing down, inquiring down their supply chain and enforcing at least transparency, some transparency to begin with. But we're seeing a big pressure from our clients, from not only investors, but also their clients now. So I think that's so true about what's happening with supply chains. We all learned a lot about them if you weren't already familiar with them during COVID. And I think that focus continues. My background is in supply chain sustainability, so it's something very near and dear to my heart. And understanding the kind of drivers and influence and what we can do together through collaboration and partnership if we really set that vision, those goals, and the mechanisms in place. Shireen, I know I only have a few more minutes of your time. I appreciate you, really do appreciate you taking some time out of your busy day. I was thinking one other question I had in my head is, we talked a lot about board culture. For someone who is, let's say, interviewing for a board position, who's considering, joining a board, what would you recommend? Because it sounds like really, I guess, what would you recommend that person to do to really assess what is the culture of the board here? What am I getting into? Is it a right fit for me?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is you need to start looking at their annual reports. And I would go back, if you can, if it's a public listed company, go back 3 to 5 years. Look at turnover of the board members. How often have they changed the board members? Who seems to be almost like part of the furniture? You will see some board members who have never left, and you can see where they are placed in other boards. Some board members are just professional board members. That's all they do. There are pluses and minuses for both, but I think that as an aspiring board member, you must know the culture of a company. So it's not just the board, but you also need to look at the executive team, the CEO. Is it new? How many times have they changed? I would also look to see if there are any major lawsuits. Look to see whether they have lawsuits from ex-staff. You might also want, there's something called Glassdoor or something equivalent. Look to see what staff are saying about the company. Sometimes staff, can actually pick up what's happening in the board and how that whole culture, the tone from the top filters through. If you can see a lot of turnover, a lot of change, you need to question why. You need to see if they have lawsuits, if they have a DPA against them, you need to see why. If the companies are not listed, you could try going, just doing Google search. We have like a companies commission where you can actually go and get the unlisted companies, you can get their financials and see what their financials look like, see what committees they have. I'm not sure of the detail in the United States for unlisted companies, but also look at what types of committees they have. Look to see who is chairing which committee. That will give you some insight. Of course, look at, the types of board members just in terms of their profile. What did they do before? Where have they worked? And which other boards they're on? Because, there are different types of boards. There are very good boards. There are boards that maybe you don't want to join because they're a bit, not on the best side of things. So I would just ask them to do a lot of scanning, because that will give you an idea of what you're getting yourself into. And be selective, because if you join a board and you have some dodgy people on that board, that's going to stick with you. So I would make sure that you join somebody that, you really believe in. Startups are good groups as well, especially if you have a few board members on the startups that have very good experience. You will learn a lot from the startup if you have other senior people there, or even an advisory board. Advisory boards are people who generally will, they're not there all the time, but the company can reach out to them. Advisory board members are very good people to talk to. They can possibly give you some very, very good ideas. Even, I wouldn't use the word mentoring, but they can at least give you thoughts about the industry and the company that you're looking to join. So those would be my first places to go.
Shireen, thank you for that advice. Thank you for everything that you've shared with us today. And our audience members will link up, of course, her book if you want to read more insights into boardroom culture. And Shireen, again, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you very much for having me on your show.